Hello, horror lover. Are you ready for a long night of nightmares? Before we begin, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, and especially leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Click the like button, all of this because the package sat on my desk, its sleek black surface reflecting the soft glow of my desk lamp. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the anticipation of the past week culminating in this moment. I, Sarah Chen, a 23-year-old optometry student at UC Berkeley, was about to embark on a journey that would change my life forever. "You're really going through with this?" my roommate Alexis asked from the doorway. Her voice was tinged with concern, but I could hear the underlying curiosity. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the package. "I have to, Lex. This could revolutionize everything we know about optometry and psychology." Alexis sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Just be careful, okay? We don't know anything about these lenses or the company that made them." Her words barely registered as I carefully peeled back the packaging. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft black foam, lay a small, iridescent case. My heart raced as I lifted it, feeling the weight of possibility in my hands. "Opti Insight," I read aloud, tracing the embossed letters on the case. "Seeing beyond the surface." With a deep breath, I flipped open the case. 2 contact lenses sat inside, looking for all the world like ordinary lenses. But I knew better. These were the culmination of years of research and development, promising to grant the wearer the ability to see people's deepest fears. "They look so normal," Alexis commented, having moved closer to peer over my shoulder. I nodded, carefully lifting one lens with a trembling finger. "That's the point. They're supposed to be indistinguishable from regular contacts." As I held the lens up to the light, I could see a faint, shimmering pattern across its surface. My stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Sarah," Alexis said, her voice low and serious. "Are you sure about this? I mean, seeing people's fears? That's heavy stuff." I turned to face her, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes. For a moment I hesitated. Was I ready for this? But then I remembered why I had ordered these lenses in the first place. "I have to do this, Lex," I said, my voice firm. "Think about the possibilities. We could revolutionize therapy, help people confront their deepest fears head-on. This could change lives." Alexis held my gaze for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "Okay, but promise me you'll be careful. And if anything feels off, you'll take them out immediately." "I promise," I said, offering her a reassuring smile. With that, I turned back to the mirror on my desk. My reflection stared back at me, dark eyes wide with anticipation. This was it. No turning back now. Carefully, I brought the first lens to my eye. There was a moment of discomfort as I placed it, followed by a strange tingling sensation that spread across my eye. I blinked rapidly, my vision blurring for a second before clearing. "Well?" Alexis asked, her voice tense. I looked around the room, half expecting to see some dramatic change, but everything looked normal. "Nothing yet," I said, reaching for the second lens. "Let's see what happens with both." As I placed the second lens, the tingling sensation intensified. It spread from my eyes to the rest of my face, then down my neck and through my body. I gasped, gripping the edge of my desk. "Sarah?" Alexis's voice sounded distant. "Sarah, are you okay?" I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. The room seemed to shift and waver as if I was looking through a heat haze. Then slowly, everything settled back into focus. I think so," I said, my voice shaky. "It felt weird for a second, but I think it's past." Alexis stepped closer, peering into my eyes. They looked completely normal. "Can you see anything different?" I looked around the room again, then back at Alexis. Everything seemed the same as before. "No," I said, unable to hide my disappointment. "Nothing's changed." "Maybe they need time to calibrate or something," Alexis suggested. Why don't we go for a walk, get some fresh air and see if anything happens? I nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Yeah, that sounds good. We made our way out of our apartment and onto the busy Berkeley streets. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as students and locals bustled about their day. At first, everything seemed normal. I was starting to think the lenses were defective when I noticed something strange. A man walking past us seemed to have a faint, shadowy aura around him. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the shadow remained. "Lex?" I whispered, grabbing her arm. "Do you see anything weird about that man?" Alexis looked in the direction I was pointing. "No, he looks normal to me. Why? What do you see?" I was about to respond when the shadow around the man suddenly took shape. Writhing tentacles of darkness reached out from his body, grasping at the air around him. I stumbled back, a gasp escaping my lips. "Sarah?" Alexis's voice was filled with concern. "What's wrong?" I couldn't tear my eyes away from the terrifying sight. I can see it. His fear. It's like tentacles of darkness reaching out from him. Alexis looked from me to the oblivious man and back. "That's intense. What do you think it means?" Before I could answer, I noticed more shadows forming around other passers-by. Each one was different. Some were amorphous clouds of darkness, others took on more distinct shapes. A woman walked by with what looked like chains of shadow binding her limbs. A child skipped past, followed by a looming monstrous shadow. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to process what I was seeing. They're everywhere, Lex. Everyone has these manifestations of fear around them. Alexis guided me to a nearby bench, her hand steady on my arm. "Okay, just breathe. Remember, you're seeing their fears, not real threats. You're safe." I nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. As I sat there, I began to notice patterns in the fear manifestations. The chains I saw seemed to represent feelings of being trapped or constrained. The monstrous shadows often followed people who appeared outwardly confident. "It's fascinating," I murmured, my scientific curiosity overriding my initial shock. Each fear manifestation seems unique to the individual, but there are common themes. Alexis squeezed my hand. "That's good. Focus on analyzing it. But Sarah, if it gets too overwhelming..." "I know," I cut her off. "I'll take them out. But I need to see more. I need to understand." We sat there for nearly an hour as I observed the passers-by, making mental notes about the various fear manifestations I saw. By the time we decided to head back to our apartment, I felt more in control, even excited about the possibilities this new vision offered. But as we approached our building, a chill ran down my spine. Alexis, walking slightly ahead of me, was surrounded by a swirling vortex of shadows. Unlike the others I'd seen, this one seemed to be slowly engulfing her. "Lex," I called out, my voice shaky. "Wait up a second." She turned, and I had to stifle a scream. Where her face should have been was a grotesque mask of decay, empty eye sockets staring back at me. "Sarah? What's wrong?" Alexis's voice came from the horrifying visage, concern evident in her tone. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Your face, your fear, it's..." Alexis rushed towards me, but all I could see was the decaying mask and the vortex of shadows. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the terrifying image. "Sarah, look at me," Alexis pleaded. "It's just me. Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." Slowly, I opened my eyes. The mask was still there, but I could see glimpses of Alexis's real face beneath it. I took a deep, shuddering breath. "I can see your fear," I whispered. It's consuming you. Decay and emptiness." Alexis was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "My grandmother had Alzheimer's. I've always been terrified of losing myself like that, of decaying from the inside out." Her words made the vision make sense, and somehow that made it even more horrifying. This wasn't just some random hallucination. I was seeing a visual representation of my best friend's deepest, most personal fear. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. Alexis shook her head. "Don't be. This is what the lenses are supposed to do, right? It's just a lot more intense than we expected." We made our way up to our apartment in silence. As I got ready for bed that night, I couldn't shake the images I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the swirling shadows, the decaying mask, the myriad manifestations of fear I'd witnessed. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, a sense of unease settled over me. I had wanted to see beyond the surface, to understand people's deepest fears. But now that I had this power, I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The weight of what I'd seen, of what I might see, pressed down on me. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. I've made a terrible mistake. The shrill beeping of my alarm jolted me awake. For a blissful moment, I forgot about the events of yesterday. Then reality crashed down on me as I opened my eyes and saw the world through the Opti Insight lenses. My room was bathed in the soft morning light, but shadows danced at the edges of my vision. I sat up, my heart racing as I remembered the horrors I'd witnessed the day before. Part of me wanted to rip the lenses out and forget this whole experiment. But the scientist in me, the part that had driven me to order these lenses in the first place, urged me to continue. "It's just data," I whispered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. "Observable phenomena, nothing to be afraid of." I got dressed and made my way to the kitchen where Alexis was already up, making coffee. As soon as I saw her, I had to stifle a gasp. The decaying mask was still there, flickering over her features like a macabre hologram. "Morning," Alexis said, her voice cautious. "How are you feeling?" I forced a smile, trying to look past the terrifying visage to the friend I knew was underneath. "I'm okay. It's intense, but I'm managing." Alexis nodded, handing me a mug of coffee. "Are you sure you want to go to class today? Maybe you should take a day to adjust." I shook my head, taking a sip of the hot liquid. "No, I need to do this. I need to understand what these lenses can do." As we made our way to campus, I couldn't help but stare at the people we passed. Each one was surrounded by their own unique manifestation of fear. A jogger ran past, pursued by a smoky shadow that nipped at their heels. An elderly man sat on a bench, transparent chains binding him to the seat. "What do you see?" Alexis asked, noticing my distraction. I described the visions to her, watching as her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Sarah," she said, her voice low, "this is heavy stuff. Are you sure you can handle it?" Before I could answer, we arrived at the lecture hall for our advanced optometry class. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I might see. As we entered the room, I was immediately overwhelmed. The space was filled with a writhing mass of shadows, each student surrounded by their own fear manifestation. Some were subtle, faint auras of unease or small darting shapes. Others were massive and terrifying, gaping maws of darkness or towering monstrous figures. I stumbled, gripping the doorframe for support. Alexis steadied me, her hand on my arm. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We made our way to our seats, and I tried to focus on setting up my notebook and laptop. But my eyes kept darting around the room, taking in the nightmarish visions. Our professor, Dr. Reeves, entered the room, and I couldn't suppress a shudder. A swarm of shadowy insects seemed to crawl over her skin, disappearing and reappearing as she moved. "Good morning, class," Dr. Reeves began, her voice steady despite the horrifying vision I saw. "Today, we'll be discussing the latest advancements in corrective lens technology." As she spoke, I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. The constant barrage of fear manifestations was overwhelming. I tried to take notes, but my hand shook, leaving illegible scribbles on the page. Halfway through the lecture, Dr. Reeves called on me. "Ms. Chen, can you explain the potential applications of adaptive focus lenses in treating presbyopia?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could see was the swarm of shadowy insects crawling over Dr. Reeves's face, her eyes boring into me expectantly. I stammered, my heart pounding. Sarah? Dr. Reeves's voice was tinged with concern. Are you feeling all right? I nodded quickly, forcing myself to look down at my notes. Yes, sorry. Adaptive focus lenses could potentially adjust their focal length in real time, allowing for seamless transition between near and far vision for presbyopia patients. Dr. Reeves nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer despite my initial hesitation. As she turned back to the board, I let out a shaky breath. After class, Alexis and I headed to the library for a study session with our friend May. As we approached her at our usual table, I saw that May was surrounded by shadowy chains that seemed to bind her to her textbooks. Hey guys, May greeted us, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Ready to tackle this mountain of work? I sat down, trying not to stare at the chains. Yeah, let's do it. As we studied, I found it hard to concentrate. The chains around May clinked and shifted every time she moved, though I knew the sound was only in my mind. I watched as they tightened when she frowned at a difficult problem, loosening slightly when she solved it correctly. May, I said suddenly, unable to contain my curiosity, do you ever feel trapped by your studies? May looked up, surprise evident on her face. What do you mean? I hesitated, unsure how to explain without revealing the true nature of my question. Do you ever feel like your academic performance defines you? Like you're chained to your grades? May was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes, she admitted, there's so much pressure to excel, you know? My parents sacrificed so much for me to be here. I feel like if I fail, I'm letting everyone down. As she spoke, the chains around her seemed to pulse and tighten. I nodded, fascinated by the visual representation of her fear. You're more than your grades, May, Alexis chimed in, oblivious to the vision I was seeing. Your worth isn't determined by your GPA. May smiled, and I watched in awe as the chains loosened slightly. Thanks, guys. I needed to hear that. We continued studying, but my mind was racing with the implications of what I'd seen. The lenses weren't just showing me random hallucinations. They were providing genuine insight into people's fears and insecurities. As the day wore on, I found myself both exhausted and exhilarated by what I was experiencing. Every interaction, every passing stranger, offered new insights into the human psyche. Later that afternoon, I decided to stop by the campus cafe for a much-needed caffeine boost. As I waited in line, I noticed a man in front of me surrounded by a cloud of tiny, swarming particles. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the space. When he reached the counter, I watched as he meticulously wiped down the surface before placing his order. He asked for his drink in a disposable cup, despite the cafe's push for reusable mugs. As he moved to the side to wait for his order, I stepped up to the counter. The barista, a friendly girl named Jamie, greeted me with a smile. The usual, Sarah? She asked. I nodded, then hesitated. Jamie, can I ask you something? That guy who just ordered, is he a regular? Jamie glanced at the man, then back to me. Yeah, that's Mr. Keller. He comes in every day, always uses disposable cups and wipes everything down. I think he might have a thing about germs. I thanked her, my suspicions confirmed. The swarming particles I saw around Mr. Keller were a manifestation of his germophobia. As I waited for my drink, I couldn't help but watch Mr. Keller. The cloud of particles around him seemed to intensify when other customers brushed past him. He flinched slightly, though they hadn't actually touched him. I felt a pang of sympathy. How exhausting must it be to live with that level of fear every day? To see threats in every surface, every interaction? Lost in thought, I almost missed Jamie calling my name. As I reached for my drink, a sudden realization hit me. I had the power to see people's deepest fears. But what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? I made my way back to my apartment. my mind whirling with everything I'd seen and learned. As I settled at my desk, I opened my laptop and began to research the OptiInsight lenses, determined to understand more about this technology that had so dramatically altered my perception of the world. Hours passed as I delved deeper into scientific papers, forums, and news articles. The more I read, the more I realized how little was actually known about these lenses. They were experimental, cutting-edge technology that blurred the lines between optometry and neuroscience. As night fell, I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. The constant exposure to others' fears was taking its toll. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the terrifying visions I'd witnessed throughout the day. A soft knock at my door startled me. "Sarah?" Alexis called. "Are you okay? You've been in there for hours." I opened the door, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the hallway light. Alexis stood there, concern etched on her face, or at least on the parts of her face I could see beneath the decaying mask of her fear. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to my own ears. "Just doing some research." Alexis frowned. "Maybe you should take a break. This can't be healthy, constantly seeing everyone's fears." I shook my head. "I can't stop now, Lex. This is incredible. Do you realize what this could mean for psychology, for therapy? If we could actually see people's fears, imagine how much more effectively we could treat them." "But at what cost?" Alexis argued. "Look at you, Sarah. You're exhausted. You've been jumpy and distracted all day." I wanted to argue to defend my decision to continue this experiment, but as I opened my mouth to speak, a wave of fatigue washed over me. Alexis was right. I was exhausted. "Okay," I conceded. "Maybe a short break wouldn't hurt." As I lay in bed that night trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The ability to see fears was fascinating, yes, but also terrifying. I had glimpsed a hidden layer of human experience, one that was never meant to be seen. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. In my quest to understand others' fears, what would I discover about my own? The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Despite the nightmares that had plagued my sleep, visions of shadowy figures and decaying faces, I felt an undeniable excitement coursing through me. I had a power that no one else possessed, and today, I was going to use it. As I made my way across campus, the now familiar sight of fear manifestations surrounded me, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, I found myself fascinated, analyzing each shadow and shape with scientific curiosity. My first class of the day was a blur of whispered fears and shifting shadows. I barely heard the lecture, too focused on the visual representation of my classmates' anxieties. As we filed out of the lecture hall, I overheard two students talking. "I can't believe Professor Zhang is making us present next week," one of them groaned. "I'd rather die than speak in front of the class." I glanced at the speaker, a petite girl named Emma, and saw a massive gaping maw hovering behind her, ready to swallow her whole. Public speaking anxiety, I realized. Severe, too. Without thinking, I approached her. "Hey, Emma, right?" I couldn't help overhearing. "You know, I used to be terrified of public speaking, too." Emma looked at me, surprise evident on her face. "Really? But you always seem so confident in class discussions." I smiled, remembering the techniques I'd learned to overcome my own fear. It took practice, but I found some strategies that really helped. "Want me to share them with you?" Relief washed over Emma's face. "That would be amazing, thank you." As we walked to a nearby bench, I watched the maw behind Emma shrink slightly. We spent the next 20 minutes discussing breathing techniques, visualization exercises, and preparation strategies. With each tip I shared, the manifestation of Emma's fear seemed to diminish. By the end of our conversation, the maw had shrunk to a fraction of its original size. Emma's entire demeanor had changed. She sat up straighter, her voice stronger. "Thank you so much, Sarah," she said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "I feel so much better about the presentation now." How did you know exactly what I needed to hear? I shrugged, trying to hide my excitement. Just a hunch, I guess. Good luck with your presentation. As Emma walked away, a surge of satisfaction rushed through me. I had used my ability to help someone, to ease their fear. It felt incredible. Energized by this success, I decided to spend my free period in the campus park. As I settled onto a bench, my gaze was drawn to a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, sitting alone on a nearby swing set. A dark, amorphous shadow hovered around him, occasionally taking the shape of adult figures that seemed to walk away from him. Concerned, I approached the swing set. "Hey there," I said gently. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked up at me, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "My mom had to go to work. She said she'd be back soon, but..." His voice trailed off. The shadow around him pulsed, and I understood. This child was afraid of being abandoned. Acting on instinct, I sat on the swing next to him. "What's your name?" I asked. "Tyler," he sniffled. "Well, Tyler, I'm Sarah. And you know what? I bet your mom is thinking about you right now, wishing she could be here instead of at work." Tyler looked at me skeptically. "How do you know?" I leaned in, as if sharing a secret. "Because that's what moms do. They're always thinking about their kids, even when they can't be with them. And I bet she's going to be so excited to see you when she gets back." As I spoke, I watched the shadow around Tyler start to recede. His posture relaxed, and a small smile appeared on his face. "You really think so?" he asked, hope creeping into his voice. I nodded emphatically. "I know so. And hey, want to know a secret? When I was your age, I used to get scared when my mom had to go to work too. But you know what helped me?" Tyler shook his head, eyes wide with curiosity. "I would draw pictures of all the fun things we were going to do when she got back. It made the time go by faster, and it made her so happy to see what I'd created." Tyler's face lit up. "I have some crayons in my backpack." As Tyler pulled out his crayons and paper, I saw the last of the shadowy figures dissipate. By the time a harried-looking woman, presumably Tyler's mother, arrived 15 minutes later, Tyler was happily showing me his drawings, all traces of fear gone from his aura. The rush of having helped Tyler lasted well into the afternoon. I felt invincible, like I could conquer any fear, solve any problem. It was with this confidence that I walked into my job interview at the campus bookstore. As I entered the manager's office, I was hit with a wave of insecurity. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Barbara, was surrounded by a complex network of shadowy threads. They seemed to pull at her, making her posture stoop and her movements hesitant. "Please, have a seat, Sarah," Barbara said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. As she spoke, I saw one of the threads tighten around her throat. I sat down, my mind racing. What was Barbara afraid of? As she began to ask me standard interview questions, I studied the shadow threads, trying to decipher their meaning. "So, Sarah," Barbara said, her voice slightly strained, "why do you want to work at the campus bookstore?" As she asked the question, I saw one of the threads pull taut, connected to a shadowy figure that looked remarkably like Barbara herself, but younger and more confident. Suddenly, it clicked. Barbara wasn't just interviewing me. She was comparing herself to me, to all the young, ambitious students who came through her office. She was afraid of being outdated, of being replaced. With this realization, I carefully crafted my response. "Well, I've always admired how the bookstore is run. It's clear that it takes a lot of experience and skill to manage such a crucial part of campus life. I'm hoping to learn from seasoned professionals like yourself to understand the intricacies of running a successful business." As I spoke, I watched the shadow threads loosen slightly. Barbara sat up a bit straighter, a small smile playing at her lips. "That's a very mature perspective, Sarah," she said, sounding impressed. "Many students just see this as a way to make some extra money." I nodded earnestly. "Oh, of course the money is nice, but I'm really looking at this as a learning opportunity. I mean, you must have so many insights after years of managing this place. I'd love to hear about how you've adapted to changes in the industry over time. With each word of praise and deference, I saw Barbara's fear manifestation weaken. By the end of the interview, most of the shadow threads had dissipated and Barbara was sitting tall, her voice strong and confident. "Well, Sarah," she said, standing up to shake my hand, "I think you'd be a great addition to our team. When can you start?" As I left the bookstore, a mix of emotions swirled within me. Pride at having secured the job, excitement at how effectively I'd used my ability, but also a nagging sense of unease. Had I manipulated Barbara? Used her fears against her? I pushed the thought aside. I had gotten the job, and I had made Barbara feel good about herself in the process. Where was the harm in that? Over the next few weeks, I found myself using my ability more and more. In class discussions, I could address my classmates' unspoken insecurities, making them feel heard and understood. At parties, I became the go-to confidant, always knowing just what to say to ease someone's anxieties. My social status skyrocketed. People sought me out, drawn to my uncanny ability to understand them. "It's like you can see right into my soul," one friend told me, not realizing how close to the truth she was. But with this newfound popularity came a price. The constant exposure to others' fears was taking its toll. I found myself exhausted, my sleep plagued by nightmares. Social interactions, once enjoyable, became draining as I was constantly bombarded by visual representations of everyone's deepest anxieties. One evening, as I sat in my room, staring at the pile of party invitations on my desk, Alexis knocked on my door. "Sarah, a bunch of us are going to the movies. Want to come?" The thought of being in a dark theater surrounded by a sea of fear manifestations made my stomach churn. "Thanks, but I think I'll pass. I've got some studying to do." Alexis was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sarah, are you okay? You've been different lately. I'm worried about you." I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. I wanted to tell her everything, about the fears I'd seen, the people I'd helped, the exhaustion that was slowly consuming me. But I couldn't. How could I explain something so impossible? "I'm fine, Lex," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. "Just stressed about midterms. Go have fun at the movies." As I heard Alexis's footsteps retreat down the hallway, I turned back to my desk. My gaze fell on the contact lens case, innocuous yet somehow menacing in the dim light. I should take them out, I thought, just for a night, just to remember what normal vision feels like. But even as the thought formed, I dismissed it. I couldn't give up this power, not when I was helping so many people, not when I was finally understanding the world in a way no one else could. As I turned back to my textbooks, trying to focus on my studies, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. But I ignored it, too enthralled by the power I now possessed, too tempted by the possibilities it offered. Little did I know, this temptation was leading me down a path from which there might be no return. The lecture hall was a sea of writhing shadows, each student surrounded by their own personal nightmare. I sat in the back, my eyes darting from one horrifying vision to another. Professor Lawson's voice droned on about cognitive psychology, but I couldn't focus on his words. All I could see was the massive, gnashing maw that hovered behind him, threatening to swallow him whole every time he paused or stumbled over a word. "Ms. Chen?" Professor Lawson's voice cut through my haze. "Can you explain the difference between explicit and implicit memory?" I blinked, trying to force my attention back to the lecture. As I struggled to form a coherent answer, I saw my own fear manifesting around me. Shadowy tendrils began to creep up from the floor, wrapping around my ankles and slowly climbing higher. My heart raced as I recognized my own deep-seated fear of failure taking form. "I'm sorry, Professor." I managed to stammer out. "I don't know." The disappointment on Professor Lawson's face was palpable, and I watched as the maw behind him grew larger, its teeth gleaming in the fluorescent light of the lecture hall. The tendrils around my own body tightened, squeezing the breath from my lungs. See me after class, Ms. Chen, Professor Lawson said, his voice tinged with concern. This isn't like you. As he turned back to the board, I slumped in my seat, the weight of my failure pressing down on me. The rest of the lecture passed in a blur of terrifying visions and half-heard words. When the bell finally rang, I remained seated as my classmates filed out, their fears swirling around them like a macabre parade. Professor Lawson approached my desk, his brow furrowed with worry. Sarah, is everything all right? You've seemed distracted lately, and your last paper was, well, it wasn't up to your usual standards. I looked up at him, trying to focus on his face rather than the fear manifestation behind him. I'm fine, Professor, just having trouble sleeping lately. It wasn't a complete lie. My nights were plagued by nightmares, vivid recreations of the fears I witnessed during the day. But how could I explain that to him? How could I tell anyone what I was experiencing? Professor Lawson's expression softened. I understand that this time of the semester can be stressful, but Sarah, you're one of my brightest students. I'd hate to see you fall behind. Is there anything I can do to help? For a moment, I was tempted to tell him everything, to rip out the lenses and show him what I'd been seeing. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I forced a smile. Thank you, Professor. I appreciate your concern. I'll try to do better. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. All right. But remember, my door is always open if you need to talk. As I left the lecture hall, I felt a mix of guilt and relief. I'd managed to avoid a deeper conversation, but at what cost? My grades were slipping, my focus shattered by the constant barrage of fears I witnessed. I made my way to the library, hoping that some quiet study time might help me regain my academic footing. But as I settled into a secluded corner, I found myself unable to concentrate on my textbooks. Instead, my gaze kept drifting to the other students around me, each surrounded by their own unique manifestation of fear. A girl 2 tables over was enveloped in a cloud of shadowy numbers and equations, her fear of mathematical failure clear in the way the figures seemed to close in on her. At another table, a boy was surrounded by ghostly figures that reached for him with grasping hands. A fear of crowds, perhaps, or of unwanted attention. I shook my head, trying to clear the visions from my mind. Focus, Sarah, I muttered to myself. You need to study. But as I turned back to my books, the words on the page began to swim before my eyes. They twisted and morphed, forming into shadowy shapes that reached out from the paper. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. Are you okay? A voice asked, startling me. I looked up to see Jake, a classmate from my abnormal psychology course. He was standing by my table, a look of concern on his face. But all I could focus on was the swirling vortex of darkness that surrounded him, occasionally taking the shape of sneering faces. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. Just frustrated with this assignment. Jake nodded sympathetically. Yeah, Professor Reeves can be tough. Hey, a bunch of us are forming a study group for the midterm. Want to join? The thought of being surrounded by more people, more fears, made my stomach churn. But I knew I needed help if I wanted to salvage my grades. Sure, I heard myself say. That sounds great. As Jake walked away, I slumped in my chair, exhaustion washing over me. How long could I keep this up? How long could I bear witness to everyone's deepest fears before I lost myself completely? That night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, the nightmares came again. I found myself in a dark, cavernous space, surrounded by all the fears I'd witnessed. They swirled around me, a tempest of shadows and terror. I saw Alexis's decaying face, Professor Lawson's gaping maw, Jake's vortex of sneering faces, and in the center of it all I saw myself, small and vulnerable, being slowly consumed by the darkness. I woke with a start. A scream caught in my throat. Sweat soaked my sheets and my heart raced as if I'd run a marathon. As I sat up, gasping for air, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror across the room. What I saw made my blood run cold. Surrounding my own reflection was a writhing mass of shadows, taking on the shapes of all the fears I'd witnessed. They clung to me, seeping into my skin, becoming a part of me. I realized with horror that I was no longer just seeing others' fears. I was absorbing them, making them my own. "No," I whispered, stumbling out of bed and approaching the mirror. "No, this can't be happening." I reached out to touch the glass, and the shadows seemed to reach back, their cold tendrils wrapping around my fingers. I yanked my hand back with a gasp. A soft knock at my door made me jump. "Sarah?" Alexis's voice called out. "Are you okay?" I heard noises. I couldn't tear my eyes away from my reflection, from the horrifying vision of what I was becoming. "I'm fine," I called back, my voice shaky. Just a bad dream." "Do you want to talk about it?" Alexis asked, concern evident in her voice. For a moment I was tempted to let her in, to confess everything. But as I opened my mouth to respond, I caught sight of the decaying mask that still flickered over her features whenever I looked at her. The words died in my throat. "No," I said finally. "Thanks, but I'm okay. Go back to sleep." I heard Alexis hesitate on the other side of the door before her footsteps retreated down the hall. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor, my eyes still fixed on my reflection. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? Or was this the price of seeing too much, of peering too deeply into the abyss of human fear? The next day I went through the motions of my classes like a zombie. The fears I saw seemed more vivid, more intense than ever before. In my abnormal psychology class, I could barely focus on Professor Reeves's lecture about anxiety disorders. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, surrounded by manifestations of every anxiety imaginable, while my professor droned on about diagnostic criteria and treatment options. As the class ended and students began to file out, Professor Reeves called out to me, "Sarah, could you stay back for a moment?" I approached her desk, bracing myself for another conversation about my slipping grades. But as I looked at her, I was struck by how clearly I could see her fear now. The swarm of shadowy insects that crawled over her skin seemed almost solid, almost real enough to touch. "Sarah, I'm concerned about you," Professor Reeves began. "Your last few assignments have been, well, frankly, they've been disturbing. Your analysis of phobias was particularly troubling. It was as if you were writing from personal experience with every possible fear." I swallowed hard, trying to find words to explain. I've been doing a lot of research," I managed to say. Professor Reeves leaned forward, her eyes searching my face. "Sarah, is everything all right? You know, as a psychology professor, I'm here if you need to talk about anything." For a brief moment I considered telling her everything. About the lenses, about the fears I'd been seeing, about how I felt like I was drowning in a sea of other people's terrors. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I saw one of the shadowy insects crawl across Professor Reeves's eye. I flinched, the words dying in my throat. "I'm fine," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Just stressed about midterms. I'll do better on the next assignment, I promise." Professor Reeves didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "All right, but remember, my door's always open if you need help." As I left the classroom, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I was pushing away everyone who tried to help. Alexis, Professor Lawson, and now Professor Reeves. But how could I explain what was happening to me? How could anyone understand? I made my way to the campus coffee shop, desperate for a caffeine boost to get me through the rest of the day. As I waited in line, I found myself studying the barista. She was surrounded by a cloud of shadowy clock faces, their hands spinning wildly. A fear of time passing, perhaps, or of being late. When it was my turn to order, I stepped up to the counter. "Large coffee, black, please," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. The barista nodded, but as she turned to prepare my drink, I saw an opportunity. Maybe, just maybe, I could use my power one more time, to help someone, to prove to myself that this ability wasn't all bad. "Hey," I said, causing the barista to turn back to me. I couldn't help but notice you seem a bit stressed. Is everything okay? The barista, her name tag read Emma, looked surprised. Oh, yeah, just a bit overwhelmed. Midterms coming up, you know? I nodded sympathetically. Yeah, I get that. Listen, I know we don't know each other, but have you tried using a planner? Or maybe some time management apps? They can really help with feeling overwhelmed. As I spoke, I watched the cloud of clock faces around Emma start to slow their frantic spinning. She smiled, looking relieved. You know, I've been meaning to get more organized. Maybe I'll give that a try. Thanks. As Emma handed me my coffee, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. I had helped her, even if just a little. Maybe this power wasn't a curse after all. Maybe I could learn to control it, to use it for good. But as I turned to leave the coffee shop, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The writhing mass of shadows was still there, clinging to me, seeping into me. And I realized with a sinking feeling in my gut that for every fear I helped alleviate in others, I seemed to absorb a little more into myself. I was losing myself, piece by piece, to the fears of others. And I didn't know how to stop it. The lock clicked into place with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned against the door of my apartment, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Outside, I could hear the muffled sounds of campus life, students laughing, music playing, life going on as normal. But in here, in the sanctuary I'd created for myself, there was only silence, and the shadows. I slid down to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest. The room around me was a swirling mass of darkness, fear manifestations from everyone I'd encountered over the past weeks. They clung to the walls, the furniture, to me. But at least here, in the solitude of my apartment, they were just echoes. Memories of fears, not the overwhelming presence of active terrors. It's okay, I whispered to myself, rocking slightly. You're safe here. No one else's fears can reach you here. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The fears I'd absorbed, the ones that had become a part of me, they were always there, always present, always whispering. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and saw Alexis's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but guilt gnawed at me. I hadn't spoken to her in days. I took a deep breath and answered. Hey, Lex. Sarah? Alexis's voice was thick with worry. Where have you been? I haven't seen you in class for days. Are you okay? I closed my eyes, trying to steady my voice. I'm fine, Lex. Just not feeling well. Thought it was better to stay home. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Alexis spoke again, her voice was gentle. Sarah, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. Can I come over? Maybe bring you some soup or something? The thought of Alexis coming here, of having to face her and the decaying mask of her fear, made my stomach churn. No, I said too quickly. No thanks. I don't want you to catch whatever I have. Sarah, Alexis began, but I cut her off. I've got to go, Lex. I'll call you later, okay? I ended the call before she could respond, guilt and relief warring in my chest. I hated pushing her away, but the thought of interacting with anyone, of being exposed to more fears, was unbearable. Days passed in a haze of isolation. I emerged from my room only when necessary, to use the bathroom or grab food from the kitchen. Even those brief forays were challenging. Every object in the apartment seemed to hold the echo of a fear. The kitchen knives gleamed with the threat of harm. The windows loomed with the possibility of heights. The closets gaped with the promise of darkness. I tried to distract myself with studying, but the words in my textbooks twisted into shadowy shapes, each page a new nightmare. Television was no better. Every character, every scene, seemed to pulse with hidden terrors. On the fourth day of my self-imposed isolation, a knock at the door jolted me from a fitful sleep. Sarah? It was Professor Reeves's voice. "Sarah, are you in there? Your roommate called me. She's worried about you." I froze, panic rising in my throat. How had Alexis gotten Professor Reeves involved? I remained silent, hoping they'd think I wasn't home. "Sarah, please," Professor Reeves continued. "We're all very concerned. If you're in there, just let us know you're okay." I could hear the genuine worry in her voice. Part of me wanted to open the door to let someone in, to finally explain what was happening to me. But the larger part, the part consumed by fear, kept me rooted to the spot. "I'm fine," I finally called out, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I just need some time alone. Please go away." There was a long pause. Then, "All right, Sarah, but please know that we're here for you. Whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone." I listened as their footsteps retreated down the hallway. Only when I was sure they were gone did I allow myself to breathe. But the relief was short-lived. Now guilt joined the cacophony of fears swirling around me. I was pushing away everyone who cared about me, isolating myself in a prison of my own making. As night fell, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The person looking back at me was a stranger. My eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles. My skin was pale, almost translucent. And all around me the shadows of fear writhed and pulsed. "What have I become?" I whispered to my reflection. As if in response, the shadows seemed to intensify, reaching out towards the mirror. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Even my own reflection was a source of terror now. I retreated to my bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters. But the monsters were inside my head now, and there was no escaping them. Sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares. I dreamed of endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different fear. I ran, trying to escape, but the fears followed me, their whispers growing louder and louder until they became a deafening roar. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the shadows more intense than ever. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some connection to the outside world. There were dozens of missed calls and messages. From Alexis, from my parents, from professors. Each one a reminder of the life I was pushing away, of the people I was hurting with my isolation. With shaking hands, I opened my email. There, amid the concerned messages from friends and faculty, was an email that made my blood run cold. It was from Opti Insight, the company that had manufactured the lenses. "Dear valued customer," it read, "we hope you are enjoying your Opti Insight lenses. As part of our ongoing commitment to customer satisfaction, we would like to schedule a follow-up appointment to assess your experience and address any concerns you may have. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to arrange this appointment." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. They wanted to check on me. Did they know what was happening? Could they help me? Or was this something more sinister? For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. Hope, maybe. Or desperation. Either way, it was enough to propel me into action. I hit reply and typed out a message. "I need help. The lenses. They're changing me. I can't control what I'm seeing anymore. Please tell me how to make it stop." My finger hovered over the send button. Was I really going to do this? Admit to a faceless corporation that I was losing my mind? But what choice did I have? I pressed send. The response was almost immediate. A new email popped up in my inbox. "Thank you for reaching out. We understand you're experiencing some difficulties. Please remain calm. A representative will be in touch shortly to assist you." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Help was coming. Someone was going to explain what was happening to me, how to make it stop. But as I waited, staring at my phone screen, a new fear began to take shape. What if Opti Insight couldn't help me? What if this was irreversible? Or worse, what if they wanted to use me as a test subject, to study the effects of prolonged exposure to the lenses? The shadows around me seemed to grow more intense, feeding off this new anxiety. I could feel them pressing in on me, suffocating me. In a sudden burst of panic, I scrambled out of bed and towards the door. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't wait for Opti Insight to contact me. I needed to get out, to find help, to do something. I yanked open the door and stumbled into the hallway. The world outside my apartment was a riot of colors and sounds and fears. Every person I passed was surrounded by their own personal nightmare. I pushed past them, my breath coming in short gasps, my vision blurring with tears. I made it to the elevator, punching the button for the ground floor repeatedly. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored walls. The shadows around me were more solid than ever, almost tangible. They seemed to be reaching out, trying to pull others in. The elevator dinged, and I burst out into the lobby. Outside, I could see the busy street, people going about their day, unaware of the horrors that surrounded them. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the world, determined to find a way to end this nightmare. But as I merged into the flow of pedestrians, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't distinguish between real people and their fear manifestations anymore. Everyone and everything around me was a swirling mass of terror. I stumbled, overwhelmed by the onslaught of fears. As I fell to my knees on the busy sidewalk, the world around me faded to a cacophony of shadows and whispers. In that moment, surrounded by a sea of strangers and their deepest fears, I had never felt more alone. The rhythmic crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the forest. Towering pines loomed on either side of the narrow trail, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I adjusted the straps of my heavy backpack, wincing as they dug into my shoulders. This was madness. I knew it. But after the overwhelming sensory assault of the city, the promise of isolation in nature had been too tempting to resist. So here I was, miles from civilization, hoping that the absence of people would mean an absence of fears to witness. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I caught sight of a small clearing ahead. Relief washed over me. I'd been hiking for hours, and my legs were screaming for rest. I made my way to the center of the clearing and shrugged off my backpack, relishing the feeling of the weight leaving my shoulders. For a moment, I stood still, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. No car exhaust, no crowd noise, no overwhelming chorus of human fears. Just nature. I opened my eyes, a small smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of peace. But as I scanned the clearing looking for a good spot to set up camp, my blood ran cold. There, at the edge of the trees, was a shadowy figure. It was indistinct, more of a darkness against the forest backdrop than a solid form. But I knew what it was. A fear manifestation. "No," I whispered, stumbling backward. "No, no, no. Not here. Please, not here." The figure didn't move, but as I watched, it seemed to grow more solid. I could make out the vague shape of a person now, tall and imposing. Was it my own fear manifesting? Had I brought this curse with me into the wilderness? A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, emerging from the trees on the opposite side of the clearing, was a man. He was middle-aged, with a scraggly beard and worn hiking gear, and surrounding him was a swirling vortex of shadows, occasionally taking the shape of a maze or a tangled forest path. "Oh, hello there," the man said, his voice friendly despite the terror manifesting around him. "Didn't expect to run into anyone else out here." I stood frozen, my eyes darting between the man and the shadowy figure at the edge of the clearing. The hiker followed my gaze, looking confused. "Everything all right?" he asked, taking a step closer. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I flinched at his approach, backing away. I'm fine," I managed to stammer out. "Just startled. Wasn't expecting company." The man nodded understandingly. "Yeah, it can be spooky out here alone. Name's Tom. You out here for a solo trip too?" I nodded mutely, still unable to tear my eyes away from the fears manifesting around us. The shadowy figure at the edge of the clearing seemed to be growing more distinct, taking on a vaguely human shape. Tom followed my gaze again, his brow furrowing. You sure you're okay? You keep looking over there like you're seeing something. I swallowed hard, trying to focus on Tom's face rather than the swirling vortex of his fear. I'm fine, really. Just tired from the hike, I guess. Tom's expression softened. First time out here alone, huh? It can be overwhelming. Listen, I was thinking of setting up camp nearby, if you'd like some company. No, I cut him off, perhaps too forcefully. The thought of spending the night near another person, near their fears, was unbearable. I mean, thank you, but I'll be fine on my own. Tom looked taken aback by my vehemence, but he nodded. All right, if you're sure. Just be careful out here, okay? It's easy to get turned around if you're not used to it. As he spoke, the vortex around him intensified, the shadowy maze growing more complex. I realized with a start that this was his fear, getting lost, being unable to find his way out of the wilderness. I'll be careful, I assured him, forcing a smile. You too. Tom gave me one last concerned look before heading back the way he had come. I watched him go, relief washing over me as his fear manifestation faded into the distance. But my relief was short-lived. As I turned back to the clearing, I saw that the shadowy figure had moved closer. It was more defined now, and with a jolt of horror, I recognized its shape. It was me, or rather, a twisted, shadowy version of me. I scrambled to set up my tent, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the poles and stakes. All the while, I could feel the shadow me watching, its presence a weight on my consciousness. As night fell, I huddled in my tent, a small lantern casting a weak glow around me. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But underlying it all was a faint whisper, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to block out the noise. But it was inside my head as much as outside. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now, fragments of fears and anxieties. Stop, I whimpered, pressing my hands against my ears. Please, just stop. But the whispers continued, growing in volume until they were a cacophony of terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made the visions worse. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw a parade of horrors, all the fears I'd witnessed over the past weeks, all the nightmares I'd absorbed. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling and whimpering. It could have been hours or minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of such relentless fear. A sudden gust of wind shook my tent, startling me out of my terror-induced trance. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers had stopped, or at least faded to a barely audible murmur. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, casting everything in an ethereal glow. And there, at the edge of the trees, stood the shadow me. It was fully formed now, a perfect silhouette of myself. But its eyes glowed with an inner light, piercing and terrifying. What do you want? I whispered, my voice hoarse. The shadow me didn't respond, but it raised a hand, pointing off into the forest. I followed its gesture and saw a faint glow in the distance, like a campfire. Without conscious thought, I found myself stepping out of the tent. The forest floor was cold beneath my bare feet, but I hardly noticed. I was drawn to that distant light like a moth to a flame. As I walked, the shadow me kept pace, always just at the edge of my vision. The whispers returned, but they were different now. Instead of a cacophony of fears, they seemed to be guiding me, urging me forward. I don't know how long I walked. The forest seemed to shift and change around me, trees moving in impossible ways. But always that distant light beckoned. Finally, I stumbled into another clearing. In the center burned a campfire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. And seated around the fire were people. Or at least, they looked like people at first glance. As I drew closer, I realized with a jolt of horror that they were manifestations of fear. Each one was a twisted, nightmarish version of a person, their forms shifting and changing in the firelight. One turned to look at me, its face a void of swirling darkness. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of whispers. "Welcome, Sarah, we've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What are you?" Another figure, this one surrounded by a corona of flickering, shadowy flames, answered. "We are what you've made us. The fears you've witnessed, absorbed, nurtured. We are a part of you now." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, this isn't real. It can't be real." The shadow me stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. Its touch was ice cold, sending shivers down my spine. "It's as real as you've allowed it to become, Sarah. You've let fear consume you, define you. We are the result." I sank to my knees, overwhelmed. The figures around the fire began to approach, their forms shifting and changing with each step. I could see elements of every fear I'd witnessed: Alexis's decaying face, Professor Lawson's gaping maw, the swirling vortex that had surrounded Tom. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I don't want this. I never wanted this." The shadow me knelt beside me, its glowing eyes boring into mine. "But you did want it, Sarah. You wanted to see, to understand, and now you do. The question is, what will you do with this understanding?" As the other fear manifestations closed in around me, their whispers growing to a deafening roar, I screamed. The sound echoed through the forest, scattering wildlife and shaking leaves from the trees. I woke with a start, my throat raw, the echoes of my scream still ringing in my ears. I was back in my tent, tangled in my sleeping bag, drenched in sweat. Outside, the first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees. Had it all been a dream? A nightmare born of stress and isolation? But as I sat up, trying to calm my racing heart, I caught a glimpse of movement outside my tent. There, just for a moment, I saw a familiar silhouette, the shadow me, watching me with its glowing eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. But its final words echoed in my mind. "What will you do with this understanding?" As I emerged from my tent into the crisp morning air, I realized that my journey into the wilderness hadn't provided the escape I'd hoped for. The fears were still with me, perhaps more vivid and present than ever. But now, I had a choice to make. Would I continue to run from these fears, or would I finally face them head-on? With trembling hands, I began to pack up my campsite. It was time to return to civilization, to confront the reality of what I'd become. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running forever. The city skyline loomed before me, a jagged silhouette against the setting sun. Each building seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a visual representation of the collective fears of millions. I stood at the edge of the park, my hiking backpack still slung over my shoulder, frozen in place by the overwhelming sensory assault. "Come on, Sarah," I muttered to myself, clenching my fists. "You can do this, one step at a time." I forced myself to move, each step feeling like I was wading through molasses. As I entered the bustling streets, the intensity of the fear manifestations increased tenfold. Every person I passed was surrounded by their own personal nightmare, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. A businessman hurried past, his suit impeccable, but around him swirled a vortex of shadowy papers and angry faces, the fear of failure, of disappointing others. A young mother pushed a stroller, her child giggling happily, but tendrils of darkness reached from her to the baby. The fear of being an inadequate parent, of something happening to her child. I stumbled, overwhelmed by the onslaught. A passerby reached out to steady me, concern on their face. "Are you all right, miss?" But all I could see was the writhing mass of snakes that surrounded them, a paralyzing fear of reptiles. I jerked away, mumbling an apology, and hurried on. My apartment was still several blocks away, but I couldn't face it yet. The thought of being alone with my thoughts, with the ever-present whispers of fear, was unbearable. Instead, I found myself drawn to a small coffee shop on the corner. The bell jingled as I entered, the warm aroma of coffee momentarily drowning out the stench of fear that seemed to permeate everything. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside, I saw that even here, there was no escape. The barista behind the counter was surrounded by a clock face, its hands spinning wildly, the fear of time slipping away, of opportunities missed. A student in the corner hunched over textbooks, shadowy chains binding them to the table, the fear of academic failure. I approached the counter, trying to focus on the menu board rather than the barista's fear manifestation. "Large black coffee, please," I managed to croak out. The barista, her name tag read Emily, smiled warmly. "Rough day?" she asked, already reaching for a cup. I let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea." As Emily prepared my coffee, I couldn't help but study her more closely. Despite the terrifying clock face that surrounded her, she moved with a calm efficiency. Her smile, when she turned back to me, seemed genuine. "Here you go," she said, sliding the cup across the counter. "On the house. Looks like you could use a pick-me-up." I stared at her, baffled by this small act of kindness in the midst of so much terror. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Emily's smile widened. "No problem. Hope your day gets better." As I turned to find a seat, coffee clutched in my trembling hands, a commotion near the door caught my attention. Two men were arguing, their voices rising in anger. "Watch where you're going, idiot!" the taller man snarled, looming over the other. I'm sorry," the shorter man stammered, shrinking back. "It was an accident," but I barely heard their words. I was transfixed by the fear manifestation surrounding them. The taller man was encased in a shell of crystalline shards, the fear of vulnerability, of being hurt. The shorter man was sinking into a pool of inky blackness, the fear of confrontation, of standing up for himself. Without thinking, I stepped between them. "Hey," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "It was just an accident. No harm done, right?" The taller man turned his glare on me, but I stood my ground. I could see his fear manifestation clearly now, could almost feel the sharp edges of those crystalline shards. "Stay out of this," he growled. "It's none of your business." But I didn't back down. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye. "I know you're scared," I said softly, so only he could hear. "Scared of being hurt, of letting anyone see the real you. But lashing out isn't the answer. It only makes the fear stronger." The man's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, the crystalline shards around him seemed to waver, to lose their sharp edges. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the coffee shop. I let out a shaky breath, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The shorter man touched my arm gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As he spoke, the inky pool around him receded slightly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I made my way to an empty table in the corner, sinking into the chair with relief. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift the coffee cup to my lips. What had just happened? For the first time since this nightmare began, I had used my ability to see fears to actually help someone, to make a difference. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. As I sat there sipping my coffee and trying to process what had occurred, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a message from an unknown number. "We've been trying to reach you, Sarah. It's time we talked. Meet us at the corner of 5th and Main in 1 hour. Opti Insight." My heart raced as I read the message. Opti Insight, the company behind these cursed lenses. They wanted to meet. Maybe they had answers, maybe they could help me. Or maybe, a dark part of my mind whispered, they wanted to silence me, to cover up whatever had gone wrong with their experiment. I glanced at the time. I had an hour to decide what to do, an hour to gather my courage and face whatever came next. As I left the coffee shop, the city seemed even more overwhelming than before. The fear manifestations were everywhere. more intense and varied than I'd ever seen. A group of teenagers passed by, each surrounded by a unique terror: social rejection, academic pressure, body image issues. An elderly couple sat on a bench holding hands, but between them stretched a chasm of darkness, the fear of loss, of being left alone. I made my way through the crowded streets, my mind racing. Should I meet with Opti Insight? Could I trust them? But what choice did I have? I needed answers, needed to understand what was happening to me. As I approached the meeting point, my steps slowed. The intersection of 5th and Main was bustling with activity, people rushing in all directions, and everywhere I looked I saw fear. A car screeched to a halt at the crosswalk, narrowly avoiding a pedestrian who had stepped out without looking. The driver's fear manifested as a wall of flames licking at the edges of the windshield. The pedestrian was surrounded by a whirlwind of debris, the fear of carelessness, of making a fatal mistake. I stood on the corner, my eyes darting from one horror to another. The cacophony of fears was deafening, each one vying for my attention. I could feel myself starting to hyperventilate, my vision blurring at the edges. "Miss Chen?" A voice cut through the chaos. I turned to see a man in a crisp suit, his expression neutral. "I'm from Opti Insight. Please come with me." But as I looked at him, I saw no fear manifestation. Nothing. He was a blank slate in a sea of terror. "Who are you?" I demanded, taking a step back. "What's happening to me?" The man's expression didn't change. "All will be explained, Miss Chen. But not here. Please, we have a car waiting." I glanced around wildly, suddenly certain that I was in danger. The fears of everyone around me seemed to press in, suffocating me. I could hear whispers growing louder, a chorus of terrors threatening to overwhelm me. "No," I gasped, backing away from the man. "No, I can't do this." I turned and ran, pushing through the crowd, heedless of the startled cries and angry shouts. I ran until my lungs burned, until the whispers of fear became a roar that drowned out everything else. I found myself in the middle of a busy intersection, cars honking and swerving around me. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of fears surrounding me. Every person, every vehicle, every building seemed to pulse with terror. As I stood there, the world spinning around me, I realized I had reached my breaking point. I couldn't distinguish between reality and the fear manifestations anymore. Everything was a swirling mass of shadows and whispers and terror. I sank to my knees in the middle of the street, clutching my head. "Make it stop," I sobbed. "Please, someone make it stop." The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was the sound of screeching tires and the sight of 1,000 fears converging on me, ready to swallow me whole. The steady beep of a heart monitor pulled me from the depths of unconsciousness. My eyelids felt heavy, resisting my attempts to open them. When I finally managed to pry them apart, I was greeted by the stark white ceiling of a hospital room. For a blissful moment, everything was normal. Then, like a tidal wave crashing over me, the fears returned. They swirled around the room, clinging to every surface, every person. The medical equipment was shrouded in shadows that pulsed with the fear of pain and illness. The window showed not the outside world, but a yawning abyss of isolation and abandonment. I let out a choked sob, squeezing my eyes shut again. But even in darkness, the visions persisted. "Sarah?" A familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Sarah, can you hear me?" I forced my eyes open once more, turning towards the voice. Alexis sat beside my bed, her face a mask of concern. But overlaying her features was the now familiar decay of her deepest fear, more vivid than ever. "Lex," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. What happened?" Alexis leaned forward, relief evident in her eyes, or what I could see of them through the horrifying mask. "You collapsed in the middle of the street. God, Sarah, you scared us all so much. What were you thinking?" I couldn't answer. How could I explain that I had been running from fears only I could see? That I had been overwhelmed by the terrors of an entire city? Before I could formulate a response, the door opened. My parents rushed in, their faces etched with worry. But all I could focus on were their fear manifestations. My father was surrounded by a crumbling structure, the fear of failure, of not being able to protect his family. My mother was enveloped in a suffocating fog, the fear of loss, of watching her loved ones suffer. "Oh, sweetheart," my mother cried, rushing to my bedside. She reached out to touch my face, but I flinched away, unable to bear the thought of that fog touching me. Hurt flashed across my mother's face, quickly replaced by concern. "Sarah, what's wrong? What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was crazy. "Miss Chen?" A new voice interjected. A doctor entered the room, his white coat a beacon of sterility amidst the swirling fears, but even he wasn't immune. Shadowy hands reached for him from all directions, the fear of making a mistake, of failing his patients. "I'm Dr. Patel," he said, approaching my bed. "How are you feeling?" I let out a bitter laugh. How am I feeling? I'm seeing things that aren't there. I'm surrounded by everyone's worst nightmares. How do you think I'm feeling? A heavy silence fell over the room. I could see the worry and confusion on everyone's faces, or what I could see of their faces beneath the fear manifestations. Dr. Patel's expression remained neutral. "Sarah, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for patients to experience hallucinations or delusions after such an event." "They're not hallucinations," I snapped, sitting up despite the protest of my aching body. "They're real. I can see them. I can see everyone's fears." "Sarah, please," my father said, his voice strained. "Let the doctor help you." I turned to him, desperation clawing at my throat. "Dad, please. You have to believe me. I'm not crazy. It's these lenses. They let me see people's fears, but it's too much. I can't control it anymore." Dr. Patel cleared his throat. "Lenses? Sarah, you weren't wearing any contact lenses when you were brought in." I froze. No lenses? But how was I still seeing the fears? I raised a trembling hand to my eyes, feeling for the familiar shape of the contacts. Nothing. "No," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "No, no, no. They have to be there. They have to be." "Sarah, calm down," Alexis said, reaching for my hand. But I jerked away, scrambling out of the bed. "You don't understand," I cried, backing away from them all. "I can see it. Dad, you're afraid of failing us. Mom, you're terrified of losing us. Alexis, you're scared of decaying, of losing yourself. And you," I pointed at Dr. Patel, "you're afraid of making a mistake, of not being able to save your patients." They all stared at me, shock and concern etched on their faces. Dr. Patel was the first to recover. "Sarah," he said gently, "I think we need to consider that you might be experiencing a psychotic episode. These delusions—" "They're not delusions," I screamed, my back hitting the wall. The room seemed to be closing in on me, the fears pressing closer, suffocating me. "Please," I begged, sliding down the wall to the floor. "Please, someone has to believe me. I'm not crazy. I'm not." My mother approached slowly, kneeling down in front of me. The fog of her fear enveloped us both. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "we want to help you. But we can't unless you let us." I looked into her eyes, searching for understanding, for belief. But all I saw was fear and worry, not for herself, but for me. "Okay," I whispered, the fight draining out of me. "Okay." The next few hours passed in a blur of tests and questions. Blood draws, MRIs, psychological evaluations. Through it all, the fears remained, a constant reminder of the nightmare I was living. Finally, I found myself sitting across from a psychiatrist, Dr. Levine. Her office was warm and inviting, but I couldn't focus on the decor. All I could see was the swirling vortex of insecurity that surrounded her, the fear of not being able to help her patients. "Sarah," Dr. Levine began, her voice gentle, "I've reviewed your case, and I have to say it's quite unusual." I let out a humorless laugh. You have no idea. Dr. Levine leaned forward, her eyes kind. Why don't you tell me in your own words what you're experiencing? For a moment I hesitated, but then, like a dam breaking, the words poured out. I told her everything. About the lenses, about seeing people's fears, about how it had slowly consumed me until I couldn't distinguish between reality and the fear manifestations. As I spoke, I watched Dr. Levine's face carefully. I expected to see disbelief, maybe even amusement, but instead, I saw something that surprised me. Curiosity. That's quite a story, Sarah, she said when I finished, and I can see how distressing this experience has been for you. You believe me? I asked, hardly daring to hope. Dr. Levine smiled gently. I believe that this is your reality right now. Whether it's caused by experimental contact lenses or a manifestation of your own anxieties, the effect on you is very real. I slumped in my chair, relief washing over me. Someone finally understood, or at least was willing to listen. So what now? I asked. How do I make it stop? Dr. Levine's expression turned serious. That's going to take time, Sarah. And work. A lot of work. But I believe we can help you regain control over these visions and eventually overcome them. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. What do I need to do? First, Dr. Levine said, we need to address your immediate symptoms. I'm going to prescribe some medication that should help reduce the intensity of these visions. It's not a cure, but it should make things more manageable. I nodded, willing to try anything at this point. Second, she continued, we're going to start intensive therapy. We need to explore why you're seeing these specific fears, what they mean to you, and how we can help you process them in a healthy way. As Dr. Levine outlined her treatment plan, I found myself relaxing slightly. The fears were still there, still swirling around us, but they seemed less overwhelming somehow, less all-consuming. It won't be easy, Dr. Levine warned. There will be days when it feels like you're not making any progress. Days when the fears seem stronger than ever. But I promise you, Sarah, we'll get through this together. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the journey ahead. Okay, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. I'm ready. As I left Dr. Levine's office, I saw my family waiting in the hallway. Their fear manifestations were still visible, still terrifying, but for the first time I could see past them. I could see the love and concern on their faces, the determination to help me through this. I approached them slowly, my heart pounding. I'm going to need your help, I said, my voice shaky. This isn't going to be easy, and I can't do it alone. My mother stepped forward, enveloping me in a hug. For once, I didn't flinch away from the fog of her fear. Instead, I leaned into it, feeling the warmth of her love cutting through the chill of terror. We're here for you, sweetheart, she whispered, every step of the way. As we left the hospital together, the world outside still pulsed with fears. But now, there was something else too. A tiny spark of hope, fragile but persistent. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed incessantly, their harsh glow making the shadows dance and writhe. I paced back and forth, my bare feet slapping against the cold linoleum floor. It had been 3 weeks since my admission, 3 weeks of therapy, medication, and constant observation, and still the fears persisted. Sarah, a nurse approached, her voice gentle. It's time for your medication. I turned to face her, seeing not just the kind-faced woman in scrubs, but the swirling vortex of insecurity that surrounded her, the fear of making a mistake, of harming instead of healing. I'd learned her name was Marie, and over the past weeks I'd watched her fear ebb and flow with each shift. Thanks, Marie, I said, accepting the small paper cup of pills. I tossed them back, washing them down with a swig of water. As I handed the cup back, our fingers brushed, and I saw Marie's fear manifestation flicker. How are you feeling today? Marie asked, her eyes searching my face. I forced a smile. Better, I lied. In truth, I felt no different. The fears were still there, still vivid, still overwhelming. The medication dulled them slightly, made them easier to ignore, but they never truly went away. Marie nodded, seemingly satisfied. Dr. Levine wants to see you in an hour. Try to get some rest until then, okay? As she walked away, I slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. Rest? What a joke. Every time I closed my eyes, the fears became more intense, more real. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the ebb and flow of fears in the hospital corridor. Patients wheeled past, each surrounded by their own unique terrors. Doctors hurried by, their fear manifestations pulsing with the pressure of life and death decisions. Sarah? A familiar voice broke through my reverie. I looked up to see Alexis standing over me, concern etched on her face. As always, the decaying mask of her fear flickered over her features. Hey, Lex, I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. What are you doing here? Alexis slid down the wall to sit beside me. Visiting hours, she said simply. I brought you some books and your favorite hoodie from home. I felt a lump form in my throat. Despite everything, despite the horrors I saw every time I looked at her, Alexis had stood by me. She visited every day, bringing pieces of my old life into this sterile, fear-filled world. Thanks, I whispered, leaning my head on her shoulder. For a moment, we sat in silence, the chaos of the hospital fading into the background. How are you really doing? Alexis asked finally, her voice soft. I closed my eyes, considering my answer. I'm tired, Lex, I admitted. So tired. The medication helps a little, and the therapy, I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm making progress, and then... And then? Alexis prompted gently. I opened my eyes, gesturing at the corridor around us. And then I look around and it's all still here. All the fears. All the terrors. It never stops. Alexis was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was hesitant. Sarah, have you considered that maybe this is something you'll have to learn to live with? Not cure, but manage? I jerked away from her, anger flaring in my chest. Live with this? Are you kidding me? Do you have any idea what it's like, seeing everyone's worst nightmares every second of every day? No, I don't, Alexis said calmly. But I see what it's doing to you, and it's killing me. I just want to help. The anger drained out of me as quickly as it had come. I know, I said, deflating. I'm sorry, I can't imagine living like this forever. Before Alexis could respond, a commotion down the hall caught our attention. A patient was being wheeled in on a gurney, doctors and nurses swarming around them. The air was thick with fear, not just the patient's terror of death, but the medical staff's fear of failure. I watched, transfixed, as they rushed past. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep living in this world of constant, overwhelming fear. I have to get out of here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alexis turned to me, alarm in her eyes. What? Sarah, no. You can't leave. You're not ready. But I was already standing, my mind racing. I can't stay here, Lex. I can't keep doing this. There has to be another way. Sarah, please, Alexis begged, grabbing my arm. Think about what you're saying. Where would you go? What would you do? I paused, considering. Then it hit me. The lab, I said, a plan forming in my mind. My old optometry lab. If this all started with those lenses, maybe I can find a way to end it there. Alexis shook her head, her grip on my arm tightening. That's crazy, Sarah. You can't just break into the lab. And even if you could, what do you think you'll find there? I don't know, I admitted. But I have to try something. Anything is better than this. For a long moment, Alexis stared at me, conflict clear on her face. Then, with a sigh, she released my arm. Okay, she said softly. Okay, but I'm coming with you. Relief washed over me. Thank you, I whispered. The next hour was a blur of careful planning and tense waiting. We timed our escape between nurse rounds, using the chaos of shift change to slip out unnoticed. The hoodie Alexis had brought became my disguise, helping me blend in with the visitors leaving for the night. As we stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a moment of vertigo. The fears were everywhere, more intense than ever in the bustling city night. But I forced myself to focus, to push through the terror. We had a mission. The campus was quiet when we arrived. Most students long since retired to their dorms or apartments. We made our way to the science building, my heart pounding with each step. Are you sure about this? Alexis whispered as we approached the locked doors. I nodded, pulling out my old student ID. By some miracle, it still worked, granting us access to the building. The familiar halls were eerie in the darkness, our footsteps echoing loudly. The optometry lab was on the 3rd floor. As we entered, I was hit with a wave of nostalgia. This was where it had all started, where I had first put on those cursed lenses. Okay, Alexis said, flicking on the lights. We're here. Now what? I moved to the supply cabinets, rifling through bottles and boxes. I need to find something, anything that might counteract the effects of those lenses. But Sarah, Alexis said, her voice tinged with frustration, you're not wearing the lenses anymore. How can you counteract something that's not there? I paused, my hand shaking. I don't know, Lex, but I have to try something. I can't live like this anymore. As I searched, growing more frantic with each passing minute, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The fears seemed to be closing in, growing more vivid, more terrifying. Finally, my hand closed around a small bottle. The label was faded, but I could just make out the words, Experimental Optic Nerve Stimulant. This, I said, holding up the bottle. This might work. Alexis took the bottle, reading the label with growing alarm. Sarah, no. You can't just use some experimental drug. We don't know what it could do to you. But I was beyond reason. The fears were pressing in, suffocating me. I could hear whispers growing louder, see shadows creeping in from the corners of the room. I have to try, I said, snatching the bottle back. I can't live like this anymore, Lex. I'd rather be blind than see these horrors for one more day. Before Alexis could stop me, I unscrewed the cap and tilted my head back. The liquid burned as it hit my eyes, and for a moment the world exploded into blinding light. Then, darkness. Complete and utter darkness. I blinked, panic rising in my chest. Lex, I called out, my voice trembling. Alexis, I can't see anything. I felt hands on my shoulders, heard Alexis's voice thick with tears. Oh God, Sarah, what have you done? As the reality of what I'd done sank in, I felt a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. But then, slowly, I realized something. The whispers were gone. The shadows, the fear manifestations, all of it had vanished. For the first time in months, there was silence. Darkness, yes, but also peace. I sank to the floor, Alexis's arms around me, and began to laugh. It was a hysterical, broken sound, but it was real. It's over, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. It's finally over. But even as relief washed over me, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. The fears might be gone from my sight, but were they truly gone? Or had I simply traded one nightmare for another? As sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, I clung to Alexis, trembling with the realization of what I'd done, the desperate measure I'd taken, and I wondered, with a chill running down my spine, if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Darkness. Endless, all-encompassing darkness. That's what greeted me as I slowly regained consciousness. For a moment, panic gripped me. Had I gone blind? Then the memories came flooding back. The desperate escape from the hospital, the frantic search in the lab, the burning sensation as I poured the experimental solution into my eyes. "Sarah?" A familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Sarah, can you hear me?" I turned towards the sound, my heart racing. "Alexis? Where am I?" I felt a warm hand grasp mine. "You're back in the hospital. You've been unconscious for 2 days." 2 days. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "Lex," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't see." "Why can't I see?" There was a long pause, and when Alexis spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "The doctors, they say the damage to your optic nerves is severe. They're not sure if your sight will ever return." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I should have felt devastated, should have been overwhelmed with regret and fear. But instead, I felt relief. "The fears," I said, my voice barely audible. "Are they gone?" I felt Alexis squeeze my hand. "What do you mean?" "The fear manifestations," I explained. "The shadows, the whispers, are they gone?" "Sarah," Alexis said gently, "there were never any real manifestations. It was all in your mind." I shook my head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. They were real to me. But now there's nothing. Just darkness." Before Alexis could respond, I heard the door open and footsteps approaching. "Miss Chen?" A deep, authoritative voice spoke. "I'm Dr. Ramirez, the ophthalmologist assigned to your case. How are you feeling?" I let out a bitter laugh. "How am I feeling? I'm blind, doctor. How do you think I'm feeling?" There was a rustling of papers, then Dr. Ramirez spoke again. "I understand this is difficult, Miss Chen, but I need to examine you and discuss your options." What followed was a series of tests. Lights shone into my unseeing eyes, questions about my peripheral vision, or lack thereof, discussions about the extent of the damage. Through it all, I remained oddly calm. The darkness that had once terrified me now felt like a cocoon, protecting me from the horrors I had seen. "Miss Chen," Dr. Ramirez said finally, his tone serious, "I won't sugarcoat this. The damage to your optic nerves is extensive. While there's always a chance for some recovery, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this blindness may be permanent." I nodded, surprising myself with my acceptance. "I understand, doctor, but can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied. Before this happened, I was seeing things, terrifying things, manifestations of people's fears. Could that come back if my sight returns?" There was a long pause. When Dr. Ramirez spoke again, his voice was gentle. "Sarah, I've reviewed your psychiatric records. Those visions weren't real. They were a manifestation of your own anxieties and fears. If your sight does return, we'll work with Dr. Levine to ensure you have the support you need to process what you see in a healthy way." I felt tears welling up in my unseeing eyes. "But they felt so real," I whispered. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Alexis, offering silent support. "I know they did," Dr. Ramirez said kindly. "The mind is a powerful thing, but now we need to focus on your recovery, both physical and mental." The next few weeks passed in a blur of darkness and muted sounds. Physical therapy to help me navigate without sight. Counseling sessions with Dr. Levine to process my experiences. Visits from family and friends, their voices tinged with worry and guilt. Through it all, I found myself adjusting to this new reality. The darkness that had once been filled with terrifying visions was now peaceful, empty, safe. One afternoon, about a month after the incident, I was sitting in the hospital garden with Alexis. The warmth of the sun on my face was comforting, the scent of flowers a welcome change from the sterile hospital air. "Sarah," Alexis said hesitantly, "can we talk about what happened? About why you did it?" I turned towards her voice, considering my words carefully. "I was drowning, Lex. Every moment, every second, I was surrounded by everyone's worst fears. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't live like that anymore. But to blind yourself, Alexis whispered, her voice breaking. Sarah, that's extreme. I reached out, fumbling until I found her hand. I know it seems that way to you, but Lex, for the first time in months, I feel calm. The fears are gone. The constant terror, the overwhelming anxiety. It's all gone. But at what cost? Alexis asked. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. My sight, obviously. My career in optometry. My independence to some degree. But Lex, I feel like I can breathe again. Like I can think clearly for the first time in so long. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the garden surrounding us. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, distant voices of other patients and visitors. What happens now? Alexis asked finally. I smiled, surprising myself with the genuine feeling behind it. Now? Now I learn. I adapt. I find a new way to live, to contribute. As if on cue, I heard footsteps approaching. Sarah? It was Marie, the nurse who had been with me since the beginning. There's someone here to see you. A representative from the National Federation of the Blind. I felt a flutter of excitement in my chest. Really? Send them over, please. I heard someone settle into the chair across from me. Miss Chen? A new voice, warm and friendly. I'm David from the NFB. We heard about your situation and wanted to reach out. For the next hour, David talked to me about resources for the newly blind, job training programs, adaptive technologies, support groups. With each word, I felt a spark of hope growing within me. You know, David said as our conversation wound down, we're always looking for people to speak at our youth outreach programs. Someone with your background in science and your unique experience, you could really make a difference. I felt a smile spread across my face. I'd like that, I said softly. I'd like that a lot. As David left, promising to be in touch, I turned to where I knew Alexis was sitting. Did you hear that, Lex? I could help people. I could use my experience to make a difference. I felt Alexis squeeze my hand. That's amazing, Sarah, but are you sure you're ready for that? To talk about everything that happened? I took a deep breath, considering her question. I think I am, I said slowly. For so long, I was trapped in a world of fear. But now I have the chance to turn that experience into something positive, to help others who are struggling with their own fears and anxieties. And what about your own fears? Alexis asked gently. Are they really gone? I paused, reflecting on the past month. The darkness that had once been filled with terrifying visions was now not empty, exactly, but calm, manageable. They're not gone, I admitted. I don't think they ever will be completely, but they're quieter now, more distant, and for the first time I feel like I have the strength to face them. As we sat there in the garden, the warmth of the sun on my face and the sound of life all around me, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey ahead would be challenging, no doubt. Learning to navigate a world I could no longer see, facing the consequences of my desperate act, rebuilding my life from the ground up. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Real, genuine hope. You know, Lex, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. I used to think I needed to see people's fears to understand them. But maybe true understanding comes from facing our own fears, from finding the strength to keep going, even when the world seems dark. I felt Alexis's arm wrap around my shoulders, pulling me into a hug. Well, she said, her voice warm with affection. Whatever comes next, you won't face it alone. I'm here. We're all here. As we sat there, embracing in the garden, I closed my unseeing eyes. The darkness that greeted me was no longer filled with terrifying visions or overwhelming fears. Instead, it was filled with possibility, with hope, with the promise of a new beginning. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt truly, completely at peace.